Well, so we wanted to get into at least three specific things tonight:
Yeah.
concealed ovulation, persistent breasts, and big boneless human penises. Those things in particular, are those rare, very rare compared to other primates or even other mammals?
Yeah, all of those are weird as shit. So, like,
Fantastic.
so we'll start with concealed ovulation, because I know that was one that you were particularly excited about as well,
Hmm.
was the this so when we look at a lot of other primate species, you have, it's very clear when you're in estrus, when when you are ready to become impregnated. And they'll have this sexual swelling is what it's called, where the labia or the vulva or even the perineal area will become engorged and brightly colored, and like this is very clearly, this female is ready to mate now. She is now producing eggs, or she's dropped an egg, she's ready to go. um Humans don't do that. We still have the same estrus cycle, but we don't show it. And there are little things that you can tell, like there's little traceable things when a woman is ovulating. We see like a tiny increase in vocal pitch, or a tiny scent change, or whatever, like these little things, a small amount of swelling or something like that, but it's nothing even close to what could be like noticeably perceived generally. It is certainly nothing even close to other primate species. Um, and so what's cool about this is that, in early terms, or in early evolutionary thought, uh, people thought that every single thing had to have had an adaptive purpose. That
Mm, sure.
everything single thing on an animal or a plant or whatever, and every part of an organism must have evolved that way intentionally, so to speak.
For a reason.
uh exactly, yeah. And that just isn't the case. A lot of, like, there's several examples of when that isn't the case, where either there is no selection pressure for or against something, that's just not a factor in your environment. And so whether you keep it or lose it, or it becomes, enriched or depleted or more or less of whatever, it doesn't really matter very much past a certain threshold. So you can just do whatever. And so you end up with all sorts of things where it's just, eh. Also,
I mean, is
there's
that
what's
just
called,
random chance? It just so happens that certain things,
yeah.
even though there wasn't pressure on them, continued to propagate?
Yeah. So, like, there's a thing like mosaic evolution, for example, where different parts, different structures can evolve at different rates at different times to all come together to be one type of thing. And that usually is something where there's a term called an exaptation, where something evolved for one purpose and then is reutilized for a different purpose later on. So, like, in that way, you could point to the position of our foramen magnums and the shapes of our spines and the bichondral angle of our knees and the shapes of our feet and the shapes of our pelvises and all these individual things, and say, yes, all these function together for bipedal walking. But if you picked any one of them, it'd be kind of weird. And if you
Hmm.
notice the fact that they all evolved at different rates over different points in our evolutionary history, they all came together to make bipedal walking the thing, and each of them was useful, or at least not harmful at the time that they happened. But, like, if you were to go back and try to trace the changing of the foramen magnum, the hole in the back of your skull, you can go all the way back to Sahelanthropus, 7 or 8 million years ago, and say, okay, well, that thing has a really low foramen magnum. It was surely walking upright. But you know, right after that, you have like Ardipithecus, which had the same damn foramen magnum and had totally different feet shaped. And so, like, that doesn't work. So that's kind of what we look at with things like this, is sometimes there just isn't a particular selection pressure for one particular thing, but that doesn't mean it isn't important, and that doesn't mean it doesn't stick around and it doesn't serve a purpose and have something, but it's just maybe not a thing that's evolution is acting on at that moment. Trying
Hmm.
not to make evolution sound like a causation too much.
I
Um,
hear that.
yeah, but and then also there's spandrels, which is a whole other fuck you that evolution gives us. A spandrel is a concept came up with by this really great biologist named Stephen Jay Gould. And you and I were talking about him. I don't remember if it was before the show or at the beginning of the show, so I'm just going to explain. He's a really important evolutionary biologist. He's a guy who came up with the concepts like punctuated equilibrium, for example. And Stephen Jay Gould talked about spandrels. A spandrel is when you're building arches in like a church or an old classical architecture, whatever. You have these big arches, and in the middle of the arch, in between each one, there's a little triangle there between the two arches. And very often they became decorated and they were all beautified and ornate. And people, if you asked, why did you put that triangle in there? I didn't. It was there because the arches are there. The arches being there
Mm.
made the triangle, and I just turned the triangle into something because it was there anyway. That's a spandrel. And so evolutionarily, you have things that like I didn't, we don't need a chin. The chin doesn't have an evolutionary purpose, but the reduction of our jaws and the shape of our heads and the reduced prognathism, this flattening of our faces, those things all came together to produce a chin that does fucking nothing, but it's there. And it has a muscle attachment here. There's a muscle called mentalis, which all it does is this: it grumps your chin up. It has no purpose whatsoever, but besides grumping the chin. And like that's a spandrel. It's something that just is there because other things are there. And we
Hmm.
see that same kind of thing when we talk about sex and sexuality in humans. Like, it's hard to tell what's a spandrel, what's a leftover, what's just something that's weird that didn't necessarily have any negative selection pressure, so it stuck around. Like,
These
it's
are the
all just
ingredients
kind
we
of up in the
have.
air.
It's not necessarily a recipe. It's just this is what we have, and whatever we
Yeah,
want to
we
cook with
dump the covered
from
in the
that.
bowl. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, kind of generally speaking, I mean, what does it mean for a mammal to have concealed versus unconcealed ovulation? How do we interpret that when we are looking at other animals?
I forgot that's what we were talking about. So,
Yeah. Yeah, well, I
sorry.
mean, like I remember when I was a kid, our we had a female dog that was not spayed, and
Mhm.
instead of handling that, we just gave our dog all of my little brother's little kid like Spider-Man underoos to wear around the neighborhood. In case anybody's wondering, like how I ended up becoming a sex therapist and having to work out some of this stuff, but my parents told me it was because when our dog was in heat we wanted to make sure not to tempt all of the other neighborhood dogs.
Yikes.
So,
Yeah.
humans, a little bit different. How do we
Big
interpret that?
surprise. That wouldn't have helped.
Yeah.
It turns out, aside from being a mechanical barrier, I guess. But
Right.
like,
Yeah.
yeah. But no, that's the thing is, when we talk about concealed versus unconcealed ovulation, lots and lots of species are they have either sexual swelling or they do a performative thing or whatever. Like, they show on their bodies that they are now ready to mate. And there's, countless primate species that have very, very much unconcealed ovulation. And so, like, you'll have like, there's this one species of, I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but they have these big red blisters that form all over their chests to show them that they're ready to go. Other ones that, like I said, the vulva or the perianal area open up and blossom with this, bright red. That's the whole point of erectile tissue. And humans, we don't do that with ovulation. We do that a little bit with like sexual arousal, not just talking about erectile tissue in like either a penis or a clitoris or with nipples, but like sometimes you'll have like flushing or something like that. Like, we have
Hmm.
like some demonstrations that are kind of similar, but
More
nothing even in the
subtle than a
same
lot of these
vein.
creatures.
Yeah, and so when the whole point of me going off on that tangent about weird shit about evolution, I remember now what I was trying to say and I got lost. Was that the 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 reason for that, for a long time we used to think that this was to protect females, that females didn't give off this any kind of indication that they were ready to go because they didn't want to be assaulted, they didn't want to be in a dominated relationship, they were trying to like protect themselves and like they could make a female selecting choice or something like this. And there's just not a huge amount of evidence for that.
Mm,
And more, like, it's looking like we have these we have concealed ovulation, not because it's an advantage, but because it isn't enough of a disadvantage to do anything different. And
mm.
like, it just, we are very much a very minimally sexually dimorphic species, where we're not quite as undimorphic as bonobos, certainly not as dimorphic as like gorillas, but we're just kind of this in the middle where there's a little bit of dimorphism, but not enough to have these big displays, not enough for any of that stuff. And we've clearly had some level of society for at least a million or 2 years. So, like, there's just not necessary to have these kinds of social cues, these kind of, displays like that.
Yeah, so there is not a strong theory or a lot of pressure on the idea that this is tied at all to monogamy,
No.
or toward pair bonding or anything along those lines.
No, not that I can tell, or at least not that I've heard. If there is, I haven't heard of it, and it's not saying much. But like
Yeah, well, you're
the
clearing
idea
up
of
some of the misconceptions that I think a lot of folks, yeah, I mean, from the book that I mentioned at the very beginning, but I think I definitely see in other places when we talk about evolutionary psychology anyway, that's a really common narrative.
yeah, and so like you have like for example, um, this is a huge question in bioanthropology is how should humans be having sex? How
Sure.
should we be mating? Like what's like the natural quote way to do things? And we look out and there's a million different markers that we're gonna surely touch on more and more as the show goes on, but like there's a million different indicators of like whether a species is going to be like a tournament species where you have the dominant male with like this harem, or they're going to be like a multi-male, multi-female society thing like we have going on, or if they're more isolated and solitary, or like if they're polygynic where you're going to have one male with a bunch of females, or polyandric with one female with a bunch of males. Like what different model are we looking at when we look at all these other primates with all these different models? Which one do humans really fit into? And pretty much consistently on every single one of these markers, we find that we are either smack dab in the middle of where we're supposed to, where everything else is,
Yeah.
or we're way off to one side for no damn reason, and like in a very clearly ridiculous way. So, like for example, one thing I know you're excited to talk about is penises.
Hmm.
You look at like penises in different ape species, and uh, uh, you talk about like the shapes and the sizes, and that, does that relate to sexual behavior? Well, chimpanzees and bonobos don't have a glans; they have like just really tapered penis, and so humans do. So we're like, okay, so that must be this new kind of apomorphic. This is a surprising thing that just came in recently, and it's very unique to us. And we can find reasons for that. That the swelling of the glands helps to pull out, create like a suction to remove competitors' sperm, and like we can find all this stuff. And okay, well that doesn't really settle how bonobos and chimps are getting by. Then, if this is such a useful adaptation, also gorillas and orangutans have glands, and they're less related to us than bonobos and chimps are.
Mm.
So what the fuck is that, right? It's
Well,
supposed to
and
be
not
it's
competing in the same way, right?
yeah,
So
and so like
just
completely
to
because
pull some of this
orangutans are
apart,
isolated
yeah,
and
I guess
gorillas are
I want to
tournament.
kind of explain to the audience a little bit. When you're talking about a glans, what we're getting at here is that there is a portion of the human penis that we have for a long time kind of believed was meant to act as like a plunger to basically
Mhm.
pull out sperm from rivals. And you're suggesting that, now that we actually look more into that, maybe not. Do I have all that right?
I mean, that is one of the like the explanations that we have for its shape, but what we don't have a good explanation for is its evolutionary history. Like
Mm,
it's just
sure.
kind of weird because like usually when you draw a cladogram, when you try to build evolutionary relationships, we look for the most parsimonious relationship based on the adaptations at hand. And so you say, here's this species 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and they have adaptations A, B, C, D, E. And if these species all have this adaptation and this one doesn't, then it makes more sense to say this one has this ancestor and then that adaptation evolved and then these other species evolved afterwards than it does to say this adaptation came in and then it went away and then it came back and then it was
Mm,
like that kind of that's a crazy,
yeah.
but that's exactly what we see with this kind of like with this particular thing, and that's not impossible. Like I can give you a million examples of that happening, but that's like supposed to be your last option of like building the family tree. And if we were only trying to build the family tree based on penises, it would look very differently than the way it does based on genetics and everything else that we have. And another thing is really interesting to think about is testicle size, because penis size is one thing, but like when we look at the size of testicles, it's another thing that you can usually use that as like this proxy to try to gauge the mating habits of especially a primate species. If it has really big testicles, then it's probably going to have this big dominant alpha male that needs to have lots of babies and be able to reproduce a whole bunch. And if it has really small testicles, there's probably a low degree of sexual dimorphism and they're better parents and all this stuff. And generally speaking, that kind of tracks. And generally speaking, humans fall right the fuck in the middle. And also, gorillas, which are like the classic example of the big mean tournament species harem having primate,
Mm, mhm.
has like the smallest penis and the smallest testicles of like anybody in our immediate family tree. So you know what I mean? Like a gorilla's penis is a fraction of the size of a human's, and it's the same thing with their testicle size. It's tiny. So why? Well, how does that make any sense? It's just primates are just so freaking strange, dude. And I'm sure that there's a primatologist out there that's beating their head against a book right now. Like, well, actually, there was this study that's out there. I haven't read it, but I'm just saying, like, we're weird in these ways. And when we look at, when we look at ourselves in the big picture, like you're asking, we tend to just be bizarre. We either fall right in the middle, or like with penis size, we have the biggest penises to body ratio out of any other primate. Go us. Uh, and we have no clue as to why. We're also like the only primate species without a penis bone. Almost every other primate has a bacillum, and so we're the only ones without bacilla, and yet we have a very large and a very large penis that stays erect for a very long time without the support structure that other apes and other primates with smaller, less long-term erections have to maintain. Why? Why?
Yeah. So the notion that a gorilla, for instance, would sort of put their evolutionary chips, and I know that we're really, really like anthropomorphizing the will of evolution, but
Yeah.
the kind of popular theory that gorillas got big and sort of focused their energies in that sense on being able to compete in these different ways externally for mates, as opposed to like internal competition where it is a sperm war between different males that have also mated with the same female. Uh,
Yeah.
is there grounding for that? I know that I'm poorly summarizing something, but is there any validity to
No,
those ideas in the first place?
you're just fine. And the thing is, like, number one, there's there's lots of ways that males compete besides just trying to suction out the sperms of other ones. Like in
Or beating
gorillas
the
in
shit
particular.
out of each other in these like
Yeah,
tournament ways
exactly.
that we're
Yeah.
discussing?
Yeah, and in gorillas in particular, you have the tournaments where they fight for dominance, and also when a new male gorilla becomes the dominant one, the first thing he does is go and murder all of the baby gorillas so that they're all dead, and now only his babies will be present. So they have this infanticide coded into their behaviors as well. So like, there's lots of ways that can happen, but like what's tricky is that it's really hard to tell the difference between sexual selection. This was this bigger penises were nicer, or it worked out this way, that this was a thing that we wanted, we went for, versus the spandrel, where it's something that we don't, this didn't really have a reason to be this way, it just kind of was, versus again something that just lacked selection pressure, and so it developed that way and it worked out, versus having an adaptation that was lost and then came back, which again is rare, but it happens. It's just not something that we have the data to be able to put a pin in right now. And everything that at least that I've read about this is very much either criticizing other studies for not having the data that they need, or just reaffirming the fact that the ball is still in the air.
Mm.
And we see this with with genitalia sizes, with behaviors, with the whether we're monogamous or polyamorous throughout our lives. Humans tend to be serially monogamous, which is weird. We're not always perfectly pair bonded. Even the way that we talk about relationships today, the idea that you should not only have a romantic relationship with your partner, but that romantic relationship should persist, and that love and feelings and romance and courtship and all these things should be persistent throughout your relationship. If you went back 50 years, nobody would know what you're talking about. Like, that's a
Mm.
very, very new concept.
Yeah.
And yet today, you and I, like, that would be, I wouldn't want to live any other way. You know what I mean? And
Sure.
so, like, everything from physiology to behavior with humans is a little bit unorthodox, and we just don't have the data we need to say we fit in this particular sexual niche within the primate clade. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah, it's worth taking at least a moment to kind of note what you're saying about how new that notion of the one partner, and
Mhm.
how many roles, how many hats you're expected to play in that relationship, how new that is. Esther Perel in particular talks a lot about this, and I really encourage people to take a look at some of her writing, because we get so frustrated and fed up when what the spark is gone from our relationship, and you never look me in the eyes anymore when you kiss my lips, and like we feel so frustrated that our partners aren't always and forever our best friend and the sexiest person we've ever met and the most
Mhm.
romantic person we could possibly be around. I mean, I certainly think of my partner as embodying so many of those things, but I think we twist ourselves into knots getting frustrated at how we aren't perfectly fulfilling all of these roles that up until rather recently we would never have expected from another
Yeah.
human being. I mean, is that all fair to say as far as you
Absolutely,
understand
yeah.
it?
Yeah, that's the thing. The relationships that we have are culturally driven. You know what I mean? Like there's still, you know, I talk about our expectation of people. What I mean is, you know, the Western global North is what I'm
Sure.
talking about. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? Because like there's still countless cultures all over the world where marriage is a thing of political status. It's a thing of economics. It's a thing of convenience. It's a thing of just focused on reproduction. One of our homework assignments when I first started college and we were taking as a you know this early American history course. One of our homework assignment was go talk to your parents and your grandparents and your great grandparents if you have them. Ask the oldest people you can find, how did your husband propose to you? And see where you'll notice this shift between will you marry me, which is what we would say now, versus, you know, a couple of generations back, it would have been will you have my children? That was the
Mhm.
main focus of marriage. That was the point. And like that today, you know, if I had asked Amber, will you have my children as the way to get, she probably wouldn't have had the same response. And so like that's because that's just, you know, that's such a weird thing to approach somebody with at this day and age. And so like when, you know, the way that we see relationships, the way that we handle relationships, the way that the expectations that we have on each other, um in terms of marriage and family and all these things, they're constantly shifting, and they should. And I encourage everybody like to evaluate what you actually want out of a partner, and don't be tied down to what you think you should want, and be willing to find somebody who's as weird as you. Amber and I, we got married on our 10-year anniversary. She's my best friend, and she always has been, and she always will be. And like that's like we were more than compatible living together, sharing everything together way before we got married. And the marriage was just like, you know what? Shit, dude, if I die right now, you don't get the things. So like we should probably make this happen to get the paperwork done. You know what I mean? So like that's not to say it isn't romantic and wonderful and happy, but we were already romantic and wonderful and happy. So like
Right. Sure.
do that. Don't find somebody who's your best friend that you also want to sleep with. That's fine. You know what I mean? That's fine. You don't have to make
It's a
it's very
functional
different.
dynamic, but again,
Yeah,
not prescriptive, right? Because it's
exactly.
probably
Yeah.
not what the vast majority of humans have done over the course of time.
Not at
Uh,
all.
yeah, so we can
Yeah.
kind of invent our own culture here, and this idea that our function should follow our biological form is at best messy.
Yeah, exactly. Is that, you know, this it's the same thing, you know, not to get to, you know, twist too many cross wires, but like it's the same thing when we talk about sex and gender, which I think was the last time I was on here for it, is
Mhm.
that those are very different things. And no matter what we pin down about biological sex, no matter what we learn about it, it doesn't do shit for the cultural construct of gender. And the fact that that changes from generation to generation, from culture to culture, from person to person, from day to day. And like that's a totally different dynamic of how a person presents themselves and the performance that they put on of what their gender is and the way that they play that out in their lives. It's the same thing in relationships. We can, you know, as much as we want, we can say, oh, okay, well, these monkeys do this and these apes do that, and they can tell us a lot about our biology as a human, and that's fantastic. Does it change shit for the fact that like I want this person for a totally different reason than you might want your person, for a totally different reason that this other
Mhm.
person might want three people for the, you know what I mean? So it's all about if you're an adult and you're all consenting, go for it. And
Yeah,
that should be
stop
the
worrying
rule.
about the supposed tos and the shoulds and just be
Exactly.
be find your
Yep,
happiness.
precisely.
Yeah.
I guarantee my relationship wouldn't work out for a lot of other people, and I guarantee their relationships wouldn't work out for me. It's yeah, do your own thing, dude.
Well, before we jump onto the phone lines, I did want to ask you a little bit more about this idea of persistent breasts. That is
Yeah.
not something I was previously familiar with, and I guess I'm interested to know human breasts. How like
Mhm.
what makes them special beyond just being awesome? I sorry, I
Right.
don't mean to be like overly much of like a straight
That's
ish dude, but I just have to ask.
No, that's I agree. Not only as someone who's at least mostly straight, but also as somebody who just is a person. They're wonderful things, and that's something that we should all be able to agree upon. Left, right, gay, straight,
We
Christian,
can all
atheist.
come together
We
around
can
this
all
one
come
central
together on this
belief.
one point. But like, no, that's the weird thing about human breasts is that they're there all the time. So like when you look at other primate species, when they are pregnant, they develop breasts and then they have a baby, they breastfeed, the baby gets weaned and goes away and their breasts reduce and they're back to normal. Humans don't do that. We develop breasts at the beginning of puberty, so usually around, age 10 to 12, and there you start to develop breasts. And then they stay with you your whole life, and they sometimes, like, they do engorge more during pregnancy. Sometimes during arousal they might swell or firm a little bit, but like beyond that they're just fucking there, and they cause back problems and they get in the way and they're hot and sweaty and there are all sorts of problems with them, but they're still there all the time. And here's a fun fact: we have no idea why. There's been countless studies on this and we
Okay, so
can't
that was my
find a
next
reason.
question. We
Yeah, we
really
have no
don't have
clue.
much. What I mean, are there leading
Zero.
theories? Like, what's
Go
the
to Google
no?
Scholar and type in persistent breasts and prepare to be bored out of your mind. There's nothing on it because, like, and there have been a million hypotheses. Generally, people like talk about, oh, it's probably sexual selection, as like we just like it, but there's
We just
no
like it.
actual, yeah, we just like it, but there's no actual indicator for that. There have been actual like morphometric studies comparing breast size and hip size and estrogen levels and like attractiveness, and we can't find a correlation that it fits across across all cultures. And you can look at, just across the, our culture here in America. Back in the 1920s, you wanted the flappers, the flat-chested, boyish, boxy
Mm.
frame, very androgynous looking. Now thick is back, and thank God for that. And like there's all sorts of like in everything in between. And you look back at other cultures where having some stomach rolls was seen as incredibly sexy because that meant that you were healthy and well fed. And then other cultures where you have that heroin chic little stick skeleton people, and if you have a thigh gap, that's what you're looking for. There's just no consistent thing where we can verify this sexual selection hypothesis. It doesn't work. And so there are a million other hypotheses, from, giving something a baby to hold on to and cling to for like years past when they're supposed to be weaned. Okay, maybe, but that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Thermoregulation was one of the more modern hypotheses. The idea that it would keep a woman warm at night because they have generally less body fat around the middle. Oh well, who knows? Yeah, that doesn't really track, considering we don't have body fat on our chests. Men tend to deposit body fat in our stomachs and the back of our necks. Women tend to deposit body fat, obviously, in their breasts, but also in their thighs and hips and waist. And so they thought that maybe this difference in like fat depositing that worked out. Doesn't really work that way either.
Mm.
It doesn't really tie to fecundity, the ability to have children. There's no real consistent thing there. So, like, that doesn't really work. There's just, every time we look for a reason, the reason comes up with nothing. And
Yeah.
so we have no idea why women have boobs all the time. And also, here's another weird thing: you and I have mammary glands as well
Mm.
that can very easily, given the right hormone balance, can develop and become fully functional. Why? And that's and there's this. We come back to this again. This spandrel hypothesis: male nipples are but potentially another spandrel that, well, the females needed them, and so the males just got them. And like that doesn't really track. It's kind of a bullshit cop out when you think of it. And so like it's yeah, we have no idea. It's one of the many mysteries of human sexuality. And I have another good one for you after. I know you got to do the thing, so like go for
Yeah.
your ad read, and then I have
Well,
another
no,
fun
we've
mystery
got
for you.
a couple of things to check in on. I guess before we jump on the phones and take these other steps, I just want to comment very briefly. We had a great conversation with Emma Thorne a couple of weeks ago about red pill culture and the manosphere and the alpha male theory and some of these things. And I mean, you know that a lot of this like social Darwinism is just bullshit on its face.
Yeah.
But it is just so interesting to me to be able to say, like, these brilliant scholars are writing these desperate papers, basically unable to explain any of these things. So I appreciate that you and I hear people, experts, quote unquote, on the internet trying to talk about some of this stuff. But if you find yourself in a, on a Reddit thread or in a 4chan forum or something along those lines, and you start getting concrete, definite answers about the human animal and about what is attractive and how,
Yeah.
people are always going to be attracted to this particular type of person. And there are these different leagues of people. It's all just such bullshit as soon as you
Yeah.
start to scratch the surface on the intellectualism and the scholastic nature of those ideas. And
Yep.
I guess I just want to continue to bang that gong as loudly and as often as we can.
The worst one that I hear all the time is that sexual selection is defining women as being whores. If they sleep with more than one guy, then it's evolutionarily not right, and that men should be able
Right.
to sleep with all the women. It's like,
The
fuck
the
you. You have
gatekeeper
no idea.
versus
Yes, the
planting
lock and
your
the key
sowing your
thing.
wild oats. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Yeah, it's all bullshit. It's all bullshit. And like it's the same thing as when people try to talk about trans people and they try to bring biology into it. Like, you don't know shit. It's so much
Fair to
weirder than
say.
you think, dude.